Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Namaskar students, I, Dr. Jainisha, Assistant Professor for English at Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University, welcome you all to the video lecture series of the university. We have taken up for today second year Bachelor of Arts syllabus of English literature, and we are supporting it with certain video lectures. It's a series of video lectures. And friends, today I am going to discuss the historical background and characteristics of the Victorian age, which is unit number 15 of paper number 3, that is History of English Literature. Students, in this session I am going to focus on these components. As you can see here, we are going to take up a brief introduction to the topic, that is the Victorian age, the general characteristics of Victorian age, its political scenario, social background as well as religious background, and its literary scenario, so that you get an idea about the Victorian period which existed in the history of English literature. So, let us begin with a brief introduction of Victorian period. Friends, in the history of England, that is the Great Britain, the Victorian era was the time period when Queen Victoria ruled England starting from the year 1837 to the year 1901, which was the year of her death. The Victorian age takes its name from Queen Victoria, who ruled England for 63 long years. Friends, Victorian period followed the Gregorian period, which began in 1714 and it ended in 1837, which is the beginning of Victorian age, and preceded the Edwardian period, which began in 1901 and ended in 1910. So, Victorian age ended in 1901. During the period of Victorian age, Britain embarked on expansion in Asia and Africa, which made British Empire the largest empire in history. There were visible efforts towards political reform as well as social reform. Michael Sadler has divided this long Victorian period into 3 parts. The first part is called Early Victorianism. The time period is from the years 1837 to 1850, which was the socially and politically unsettled period in Britain. The second part is called Mid-Victorianism, which started from the years 1851 to 1879, which was the period of success for Britain. It was British heyday, the golden age of Victorian period. Then the third and last part is called Late Victorianism from the years 1880 to 1901, and it came with its new intellectual waves and movements in the fields of art, literature and nations' ideologies. Friends, with these brief introduction, let us proceed towards certain general characteristics of the Victorian age. Friends, Victorian age was full of contradictions, that is, contrasting forces were prevalent in Victorian age. On one hand, there was industrialization and technological advancements, progress, and on the other hand, there was extreme poverty. There was rising lower class, working class, and there was exploitation of factory workers. There were social reforms on one hand, and on the other hand, scientific discoveries were taking place. In the midst of that, religious unrest was also visible. During this time, the Great Britain was transformed from an agricultural country to an industrial country, with innovation in machines as well as textile industry and building of new roads, construction of new roads and railways. This transformation resulted in the migration of rural people from the countryside, from the villages to the industrial areas, to the urban areas, for they wanted to search for job, they wanted to earn a living. Many of the cities and towns of the North Britain, which was the most industrialized area, were actually created during this Victorian period. So, within a few years, more English and Welsh people lived in cities and towns rather than in the villages and countryside. With this advancement, with this progress, there also arose a darker side of urbanization. Now, let us glance upon the political scenario or the historical political background that existed before and during the Victorian age. Friends, the major characteristic of Victorian era was the search of reform, reinvention and improvement at individual level as well as societal level. So, individuals and society. Queen Victoria's government was led by the Whig Prime Minister. The two parties existed, Whigs and Tories. But after the Whig Prime Minister resigned, the Tory politician set up a new ministry. So, this was a changing period. On international front, British Imperial India initiated the first Anglo-Afghan War. In the year 1845, the Great Famine occurred, and as a result, there began a mass starvation, disease and deaths in Ireland, and the effects were visible in Britain. Also, after a few years, that is in the year 1853, Britain fought against Russia, where Britain and France formed an alliance. Further, during 1857 to 1858, an uprising by sepoys against the East India Company was suppressed, and this event led to the end of company rule in the imperial, that is the British India, and the administration, the ruling power was transferred to the direct rule by the British government. Though the princely states of India were not affected and remained under British guidance. So, this was the general political scenario. Also, in the year 1867, the Second Reform Act was passed. Now, what was Second Reform Act? The act granted the right to vote to the urban male working class of England, which was prohibited earlier. Now, let us proceed to know about the social and religious scenario that existed in the Victorian period. When Queen Victoria came to the English throne, when she started ruling in 1837, there were certain circumstances through which Britain could be divided into three tiers, namely aristocracy, middle class, and the working class. And obviously, as the classes differed, the living standard, the living conditions also differed. That of laborers and those of the other two social classes of Victorian society were quite different from the way of living of aristocrats of the richer class, of the elite class. It created an intolerable overcrowding. The houses were mainly built back to back and side by side. So, urbanization and its darker effects were visible. They had no piped water, no sanitarians. The living condition deteriorated and it gave rise to epidemics and diseases. Industrialization and technological progress further advanced the position of the middle class, but the laborer class and the working class suffered alongside. By the end of the century, they held power which was previously held by the aristocracy, and class distinction became more financial than hereditary. Now, due to industrialization, the middle class also started progressing. Victorian middle classes were very proud of the nation's triumphs in technology and industrialization along with engineering, which had so changed the look of the environment. It gave the middle class the opportunity to earn more and to improve their living standards, as well as of their political stability, the freedom of its press, its legal system. Now they were a part of the nation. Optimism was the dominant mood in the people of Britain. They believed the way of living could be exported to all parts of the growing empire. Their material progress, that is, their interest in making money and reaching a good position, was also reflected in the houses they lived. So, it was directly their rising condition, their richness was reflected in the houses they lived in. There was a proliferation of ornaments in buildings, and there was visible accumulation, collection of pieces of antique furniture inside the Victorian house. Another feature was the society of Victorian age was that centrality of family was the dominant feature. So, the family values were more prominent for all the classes equally. The issues such as working wives, overpaid youths, harsh factory conditions, harsh working conditions, bad housing, poor sanitation, excessive drinking, religious unrest, religious decline were to be dealt with. So, these were the issues that were of concern for the society. There was a strong belief in the family values, which was families were usually large and in which the father's authority was unquestioned. So, it was becoming a patriarchal, taking a patriarchal mode. Middle class girls were closely guarded by their parents till their marriage. Generally, middle class girls were allowed to spend their time reading novels, having singing lessons, learning to play the piano, etc. So, they were more interested in the domestic tasks, in their hobbies, which can be pursued by staying at home. This was the good side of the picture, but the emerging middle class norm for women was such that they were not encouraged to come out of their homes. The norms were such that the women should dominate in the realm of domestic life, not the outside life. They are supposed to focus on their family, the husband, the children, the household, religion and moral behavior. Friends, a long poem called The Angel in the House, which was written by Coventry Petmore. This poem portrayed the situation, the position of Victorian woman, who is the angel in the house. She is pure and she is devoted to her family and home. So, these women were looked up as angels and as pure women. The other side, the bad one, was represented by prostitution and very high crime figures in large cities, especially in London, the posh area of Britain. On the religious front, friends, religion became a battleground during this Victorian period. The non-conformist fought bitterly against the Church of England, against the religious institutions. Penalties on Roman Catholics were mostly removed. Doubts about the Old Testament of Bible grew as the scientific outlook rapidly gained ground in the educated class. So they were more inclined towards the reason and science rather than on the Old Testament. In religion, the Victorians experienced a great age of doubt, the first of its kind, which questioned Christianity and Church along with its institutions on such a large scale. Now friends, having this background, let us see the literary scenario of Victorian period. From a literary point of view, friends, the Victorian age was above all, it was the age of fiction, mainly because of the great popularity this literary genre gained during this period, which was novel. Many outstanding writers turned to novelists, and the number of novels were published yearly. The numbers enormously increased, and large number of publications in the novel forms took place. Novels were also serialized in magazines, and this required that each single episode had to contain an element of suspense and surprise to keep the interest of the audience, of the readers, to keep the interest as well as the curiosity of the reader alive. The quantity of fiction produced to meet the demand increased the existing gap between good fiction and bad fiction, because the demand was such that they had to produce, they had to publish continuously. Novelists saw and denounced the evils of the time. So the bad things, the evils of the society, such as poverty, the exploitation of children and factory workers, the inadequate educational system, these were the reality, these were the evils, but it was the reality which was neglected. But like the reading public, they didn't question the basic idea that the system was right or that progress was inevitable and the evils were only a temporary result of the progress that was taking place in the Victorian age. Friends, the first part of the Victorian age is characterized by the triumph of realistic novel. So novel form was at the topmost of the literary genres. The aim of the realistic fiction is to represent life as it really is. That is called realistic fiction. The author's main concern was that the reading public should find his or her work credible and truthful. So there was an attempt to showcase the reality in the novels. Both events as well as the characters were interpreted and judged by an external narrator who expressed the dominant moral views of the time. In English society, there was a hint of growing liberalism which brought about social reforms, and these reforms were reflected in certain writers, especially in the author Charles Dickens. He greatly involved himself in this work. The admiration of frivolous aristocracy is one of the attitudes that Charles Dickens often satirizes in his great works, the novels such as Great Expectations. So Charles Dickens attempted and he successfully showcased the reality in his novels. In literature and the other arts, the Victorians attempted to combine romantic emphasis upon self, emotion, and imagination with neoclassical ones upon the public role of art and the parallel responsibility of the artist. Further, the prophetic writings of Carlyle and Ruskin Bond were highly regarded in this during this period because they reflected the engaging emotion, the prevalent emotion of the Victorian age. The prophetic writings of Carlyle and Ruskin, as well as the criticism of Arnold and the empirical prose of Darwin and Huxley. These as were the fantasy and of George MacDonald and the realism of George Eliot, as well as George Bernard Shaw. This was the prominent writers and their works. Now let us see certain features of literature, Victorian literature. In the Romantic age, poetry had been the dominant feature, whereas in the Victorian age, novel was the most important feature. Charles Dickens dominated the first part of Victorian age. That is early Victorianism. His first novel, The Pickwick Papers, was published in 1836. William Thackeray's most famous work, Vanity Fair, was published in 1848, and the three Bronte sisters, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, and Anne Bronte, they also published significant novels in 1840s. A major later novel was George Eliot's Middlemarch in 1872, and another major novelist was Thomas Hardy, whose first novel appeared in 1872 called Under the Greenwood Tree. Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson also were Victorian England's most famous poets. Thomas Hardy and Gerard Manley Hopkins too wrote poetry, but their poetry was published posthumously in 1918, that is after they died. So they were Victorian poets, but their work published after the age. Charles Swinburne is also considered an important literary figure of Victorian poet, especially his poems and critical writings. Early poetry of W.B. Yeats was also published in Queen Victoria's rule. Later on, during 1890s, the dramas by George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest also came onto the literary front of Victorian age. Another important feature that Victorians are credited with is that of inventing childhood, partly via their efforts to stop child labor, child exploitation, and the introduction of compulsory education. Writers like Lewis Carroll and Anna Sewell wrote mainly for children and produced children's literature. Also, the Victorian era was famous. It was important for the development of science, and the Victorians had a mission to describe and classify the entire natural world. Charles Darwin's work on the origin of species emerged in the Victorian age. His theory of evolution contained within the work challenged many of the ideas that the Victorians had about themselves and the place and the world and the times they lived in. Also, the philosophical writings of John Stuart Mill were on the topics such as logic, economics, liberty, and utilitarianism. Friends, utilitarianism is the ethical theory that promotes actions which results in happiness and well-being. So these were the topics that the writers wrote on. Histories were also popular during this time. The histories of Thomas Carlyle, Thomas Macaulay, John Ruskin were highly influential in Victorian era. So friends, as discussed here, you now have the idea the general idea about the England of 19th century in terms of its general characteristics, introduction, political front, social front, religious front, living standards, as well as literary front that were prevalent during the Victorian age. Now, before this session ends, I would like to offer some questions which are based on the characteristics of Victorian era, Victorian age. Friends, here are some of the questions to check your self progress. Attempting answers of these questions will give you a clearer idea on the topic that we have taken up today. Further, here are some of the references which you can take up for further reading. The first one is A Critical History of English Literature in 2 volumes, volume 1 and volume 2 by David Deutsches, as well as there is a book called English Literature by W.J. Long. And below are certain links given to you from the open sources available on the internet, which may be helpful references for further reading, and which is suggested that you read for the deeper knowledge on this topic. So friends, thank you for watching the video. I hope it has helped you in understanding the Victorian age from the perspective of history of English literature. So friends, goodbye and see you around next time. Thank you.